While miners and cattlemen and cowboys created the romantic legend of the West, it was really the sober sawduster, the farmer, who wrote the final chapter of frontier history. A fresh day dawned for Western farmers with the Homestead Act of 1862, and we'll be talking about that in part on this section, Settling on the Great Plains. Here's some of the vocab that we're going to be introduced to today. Exodusters and soddies, Homestead Act. If we get far enough, we'll also cover the Morrill Land Grant Act, the Hatch Act, and Bonanza Farms. So settling on the Great Plains. Settlers move westward to farm. This is a fact for the margins of your notes. It took 250 years from the first settlement at Jamestown until 1870 to turn the first half of the United States, the first 400 million acres of forests and prairies, into flourishing farms. Settling the second half, the second 400 million acres, took 30 years, from 1870 to 1900, and it had everything to do with what we're going to talk about today: federal land policies, completion of the transcontinental railroad lines, and the federal programs that pushed people to the West. So one more time, 250 years for the first half of the United States, 30 years for the second half, 1870 to 1900. One of the primary reasons for that rapid settlement had to do with railroads. Railroads offered a rather risk-free way of moving to the West. And so all you needed was to save money, and all of a sudden the journey was a doable thing for anyone who wanted to move west. From 1850 to 1871, the federal government made huge land grants to railroads, about 170 million acres worth $500 million. And they did it for, they subsidized the railroad companies to lay track in the West. In one grant, both the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific received 10 square miles of public land for every mile of track they laid in a state, and 20 square miles of land for every mile of track they laid in a territory. That was the desire that the United States government had to settle this West quickly. In the 1860s, two companies began a race to lay the track that would become the very first transcontinental railroad. The Central Pacific moved eastward from Sacramento, and the Union Pacific moved westward from Omaha, Nebraska. Civil War veterans, Irish and Chinese immigrants, African Americans, Mexican Americans did most of the grueling labor. In the late 1868, workers for the Union Pacific cut their way through the solid rock of the mountains, laying up to 8 miles of track in a day. Both companies had reached Utah by the spring of 1869. 15 years later, the country would boast 5 transcontinental railroads. Here you see the Golden Spike ceremony at Promontory Point, Utah, when the Union Pacific, which is over here, met the Central Pacific, which is over here, when they met together. Now, obviously, they ceremoniously put a gold spike in, but they removed it right away because gold isn't good for holding those pieces into place at all. And just kind of FYI, there was a bet between the two as to who could lay the most track in a day, and 10 miles was laid, and that was the winner of the bet. However, it wasn't done well enough to actually withstand the weight of fully loaded railroad cars and trains, and so they had to go back and refortify it after this moment right here. The railroad companies sold, hang on just a second, I went a little bit too far. Both companies had reached Utah by the spring. 15 years later, the country boasted 5. The rails to the east of and west coast were forever linked. And kind of interestingly, the railroad lines will run the gamut of the kind of geography of the United States. There'll be one in the far south, one in the far north, and then a couple moving through the midsection of the country. The railroad companies sold some of their land to farmers for $2 to $10 an acre, and some companies successfully sent agents all the way to Europe to recruit buyers. By 1880, 44% of the settlers in Nebraska and more than 70% of those in Minnesota and Wisconsin were immigrants. And just kind of FYI, in this particular area, the 70% of immigrants that traveled to Minnesota and Wisconsin, those tended to be from places like Finland and Norway and Sweden, places like that, where they had logged at home and then came to the Great Lakes region where logging was also a key industry where they could do what they were good at. And then they moved actually all the way to the Pacific Northwest, and a lot of your local communities around here, like Rochester, was largely Swedish. PL and the Dodie area were Finnish and Swedish further out. And so a lot of those migrant groups moved to areas where they could continue to do what they were good at home. Here's a quick map. It's not the best map, but it kind of shows you the amount of land granted to the railroad. This is a huge subsidy, a huge gift to the railroad companies, because they made that money back when they sold those acres for $2 to $10 an acre near their railroad line. Also, small towns along the way were fighting to get the railroads to run through their town, and so there's all sorts of manipulation and corruption going on as towns fought to bribe railroad officials to run the route through their town. There was a huge fight between Seattle, Portland, Tacoma, Centralia. All those towns were vying for this railroad to kind of end right in their territory. Take a look at one more map. Where'd you go? Hang on. Okay, here's the map in a little bit bigger detail. So one of the reasons these swaths were bigger up here is that the territorial status, they granted twice as much land to the railroads if they would run through a territory, because the whole idea was we still needed to draw population into these territories. States, on the other hand, had smaller swaths of land. I know that right in this area here you can see smaller swaths of land running through Colorado and Utah, but we were more concerned with drawing our population up here where there were disputes. And we had disputes here over the border, and we wanted to be able to admit this territory, the Pacific Northwest, as states as quickly as possible. Okay, back to our business. There are a number of different types of farm machinery that are going to make a huge difference in the settlement of the West. As we talked about before, John Deere and his steel plow in 1837 were the first to kind of break through that sod and lead people to believe that this was a place where you could farm effectively. But then other inventions like a seed drill that could not only put seed into like the proper depth of soil, but also space it out so you wasted less seed. One of the big costs to farmers today is buying seed, especially now that they're required to buy seed every year from places like Monsanto. There's John Deere, the original, and his steel plow. It says it came out in 1833, but it's largely not available. It's too expensive until a little bit later than that. The reaper it allows people to harvest and gather grain products more efficiently and effectively. And by 1838, we have the first combine, which is a combination reaper that cuts the grain and gathers the grain together. These technologies were expensive. Corn binder, steel plow, and harrow. Take a look down here in this red box. 1830, a bushel of grain took 183 minutes to harvest. By 1900, due to these new types of technologies, it took you 10 minutes. Okay, now supply and demand issues. Now take a look at this bushel of wheat. 1886 to 1887, the bushel of wheat fell from $2 per bushel to 68 cents because of the increased product that was out there on the market. Another powerful attraction of the West was the land itself. In 1862, Congress passed the Homestead Act, which offered 160 acres of free land to any citizen or even intended citizen. So you didn't even have to be a citizen. If you just said, yeah, I plan on becoming one, if you were head of household, you could apply for the Homestead Act. From 1862 to 1900, 600,000 families took advantage of the government's offer. Several thousand settlers were exodusters, which are, post-Civil War in particular, exodusters were newly freed blacks who didn't know, where else to go. And so a lot of Southern African Americans headed west for the opportunity to have land for the very first time in their lives. Not the majority. The majority of blacks actually stayed in the southeast part of the United States, but there were chunks of people called exodusters. Despite the massive response by homesteaders or settlers on this free land, private speculators and railroads and state agents sometimes used the law for their own gain. Cattlemen fenced open lands, miners and woodcutters claimed national resources. Only actually about 10% of the land was actually settled by families for whom it was intended. In addition, not all plots of land were of equal value. Although 160 acres could provide a decent living in the fertile soil of Iowa or Minnesota, settlers on the drier western land required larger plots to make farming worthwhile. For example, in like the Arizona, New Mexico area, I know that there was a different act that provided actually 320 acres, and all you had to do was figure out ways to irrigate it. Eventually, the government strengthened the Homestead Act and passed more legislation to encourage more settlers. In 1889, a major land giveaway in what is now Oklahoma attracted thousands of people. In less than a day, land-hungry settlers claimed 2 million acres in a massive land rush. Some took possession of the land before the government officially declared it open, and because of that, settlers claimed land sooner than they were supposed to. Oklahoma became known as the Sooner State, and football teams and basketball teams are called the Oklahoma Sooners as a result. As settlers gobbled up the western land, Henry Washburn and fellow explorer Nathaniel Langford asked Congress to help protect the wilderness from settlement. In 1870, Washburn, who was surveying land in the northwestern part of Wyoming, described the area's geysers and bubbling springs as objects new in experience, possessing unlimited grandeur and beauty. In 1872, the government created Yellowstone National Park. 7 years later, the Department of Interior forced railroads to give up their claim to western landholdings that were equal in area to New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia combined. Despite all that land being set aside, by 10 years later, the Census Bureau declared that the country no longer existed and had continuous frontier line. The frontier no longer existed. To many, the frontier was what had made America unique. And this is where we started the whole unit. In an 1893 essay entitled The Significance of the Frontier in American History, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner agreed with this notion and said, American social development has been continually beginning over again on the frontier. This rebirth, this fluidity of American life, this expansion westward with its new opportunities, its continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society, furnished the forces that dominate American character. Today, many historians question Turner's view. They think he gave too much importance to the frontier in the nation's development and in shaping the special American character. But at the same time, for many, many years, it was the essay that really dominated the way that we viewed the West and how we valued the West. These are some pictures from Yellowstone and the geysers and the bubbling pots, the painted pots. I believe that's what this piece on the left is called. Old Faithful Geyser. And the next time we meet, we're going to talk about what kind of, what settling on the plain looked like, because it was difficult work. No trees, which made for interesting building materials, and soddies like the one you're looking at right now.